Daisy, stop it! What has gotten into you? Hannah Reynolds let out an exasperated sigh as she watched her golden retriever scratch furiously at the closet door in the guest bedroom. The sound of Daisy's nails against the wood was grating, persistent. It had started 3 nights ago, always at the same time, right around 9 p.m., and it wasn't the usual restless pacing or whining for a late-night treat. No, this was different. This was urgent. Hannah ran a hand through her long blonde hair, tired after a long day at work. She glanced at the clock. 9:04 p.m. Right on schedule. Daisy had never acted like this before. Sure, she was an energetic, happy dog, always eager for a walk or a game of fetch. But this was something else. The scratching, the occasional whimper, the way her ears perked up as if she were listening for something beyond Hannah's perception. It was starting to unsettle her. "All right, girl. Come on," Hannah coaxed, stepping closer to gently pull Daisy away. "There's nothing in there. Just some old coats and—" Before she could finish, Daisy barked. A sharp, sudden sound that sent a jolt up Hannah's spine. It wasn't an aggressive bark, but it wasn't playful either. It was the kind of bark a dog used when something was wrong. Hannah hesitated, fingers brushing the closet handle. What was she expecting? A mouse? A draft making the old door creak? Maybe something had fallen inside, shifting and making noises that only Daisy could hear. Still, she couldn't shake the odd feeling settling in her chest. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and pulled the door open. Silence. She stared into the small, dim space. The single overhead bulb flickered slightly as it cast light over the contents. Winter coats, a box of holiday decorations, a few spare blankets folded neatly on a shelf. Nothing out of the ordinary. Daisy, however, stood completely still, her nose twitching as she sniffed the air. Then she whined and stepped inside, pawing at the floor. Hannah frowned. "What is it, girl? There's nothing—" Her breath hitched. There was something there. A faint scuff on the hardwood floor, right near where Daisy was sniffing. Kneeling, Hannah brushed her fingers over it. The scratches looked fresh, not deep, but recent enough to stand out. Almost like— She pulled back abruptly. No. That was ridiculous. She was letting her imagination get to her. Still, her heart pounded as she looked back at Daisy, who was now lying down, pressing her nose against the floor as if trying to push her way through. Hannah hesitated before standing and stepping back. "All right, Daisy. I don't know what you're trying to tell me, but there's nothing here." Daisy whined again, refusing to move from her spot. Hannah sighed. "Fine. We'll check tomorrow when I have better light. How about that?" She reached for Daisy's collar and gently guided her out of the closet, shutting the door behind them. "Come on, let's get you a treat." The golden retriever followed reluctantly, glancing back at the door one last time before trotting to the kitchen. Hannah tried to shake the uneasy feeling clinging to her as she rummaged through the treat jar. Maybe Daisy had just smelled something interesting, a forgotten bag of treats from last winter, or a scent that only a dog's sharp nose could detect. That had to be it. But even as Daisy happily took the biscuit from her hand and curled up in her usual spot, Hannah couldn't shake the thought that something didn't feel right. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the blinds, Hannah stood in front of the closet again. Daisy sat beside her, tail wagging slightly but eyes locked on the door. Taking a deep breath, Hannah opened it again. She pulled out the coats, one by one, stacking them on the bed. Then the blankets. Then the box of decorations. Soon, the closet was completely empty. except for the floor, and the tiny, almost imperceptible gap near the baseboard. Frowning, she ran her fingers over the wood again, pressing lightly. A sudden shift beneath her fingertips made her jerk back. Daisy barked excitedly. Hannah swallowed, staring at the floor. There was something underneath. Hannah's breath hitched as she stared at the baseboard, her fingers still hovering just above the faint gap. She wasn't sure if she had imagined the slight movement, but Daisy certainly hadn't. The golden retriever had her nose pressed firmly against the floor, her tail swishing side to side, ears alert. There was something there. Something beneath the closet. Her mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just a loose board. Maybe years of settling had shifted the foundation. But deep down, she knew there was more to it. Daisy wouldn't be so determined otherwise. Swallowing, Hannah reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight, angling it toward the narrow space where the wood met the wall. The light illuminated dust, specks of dirt, and then a seam. Her pulse quickened. The floor wasn't solid. It was a panel, one that didn't quite fit seamlessly with the rest of the hardwood. She ran her fingers over the edges, pressing gently. It didn't budge. Hannah bit her lip, glancing at Daisy, whose tail thumped against the floor impatiently. "Okay, girl," she murmured, bracing herself. "Let's see what we've got." She stood and walked briskly to the garage, rummaging through a small toolbox until she found a flathead screwdriver. Back in the guest room, she knelt beside the panel and wedged the tip beneath the seam, applying light pressure. The wood resisted at first, but then, with a soft creak, the edge lifted slightly. Hannah exhaled sharply. It really was a compartment. She pried the panel further until she could get her fingers underneath and carefully lifted it away. A small cavity lay beneath, no more than a foot deep. Dust swirled in the dim light as she leaned closer, heart hammering. At first, all she saw was darkness, but as she shifted her flashlight, something caught the glow. A bundle wrapped tightly in faded cloth. Her stomach clenched. This was old. It had been here a long time. Daisy whined beside her, pressing closer as if urging Hannah to take the next step. Hesitantly, she reached into the space and grasped the bundle, lifting it out carefully. It was lighter than she expected. The fabric was stiff with age, frayed at the edges. She laid it on the floor and, with trembling fingers, peeled back the first layer. Photographs, letters, and something small wrapped in a separate cloth. Hannah's breath caught. The photographs, yellowed with time, showed faces she didn't recognize. A man in a crisp military uniform. A woman in a long, modest dress standing beside him, her smile faint but warm. Another photo showed them together in front of a house. Not this house, but one similar in style, suggesting it had been taken decades ago. A family. Strangers. Yet somehow they had a connection to this place. She picked up one of the letters. The ink faded, but legible. "My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't make it back. I pray you and little James are safe. You mustn't let fear guide you, my love. Whatever happens, know that you were the best part of my life. Keep this safe for him. When the time is right, he'll understand. Yours forever, Thomas." Hannah's fingers tightened around the letter. Her throat felt dry. Who were they? And what had happened that made this man leave such a message behind? She picked up the last item, the small bundle wrapped separately. Inside, she found a locket. The gold was dulled with age, but when she pried it open, she found two tiny pictures. The same man, the same woman, and between them, a child, perhaps James. Daisy let out a small huff and rested her chin on Hannah's knee. She ran a hand over the dog's soft fur, her mind spinning. How long had this been hidden? And why had Daisy been so determined to find it? She had to know more. Over the next few days, Hannah threw herself into research. She scoured old records, visited the local library, and even reached out to a historical society. The house she lived in had been built in the 1940s, and its history was patchy at best. But one detail stood out. A family named Lawson had lived there during the 1950s. Thomas Lawson had been a soldier, reported missing during the Korean War. His wife, Claire, had remained in the house for years before selling it. Their son, James, had been just a toddler when Thomas had left. It was a heartbreaking story. A young widow, a child who likely grew up with more questions than answers. But why had these keepsakes been hidden away rather than taken with them when they left? Hannah sat on the couch one evening. Daisy curled up beside her, staring at the locket in her palm. She knew what she had to do. Finding James Lawson wasn't easy. The records showed he had moved out of state decades ago, but after hours of searching, she found a lead, an address in Tennessee. It was a long shot, but she had to try. Taking a deep breath, she carefully packaged everything, the photos, the letters, the locket, and wrote a short note explaining what she had found. She hesitated before sealing the envelope, but in the end, she included her phone number. If James wanted to know more, he could reach out. 2 weeks passed before she received the call. "Hello?" she answered, heart pounding as she saw the unfamiliar number. "Is this Hannah Reynolds?" The voice on the other end was deep, slightly raspy with age. "Yes," she said, gripping the phone. "Is this James Lawson?" A long pause. "It is. I got your package. I don't know what to say." Hannah swallowed. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to hear from me, but when I found those things hidden in my house, I knew they had to belong to someone. Your father. He left them for you." Another pause, then a quiet exhale. "I never knew. My mother never mentioned anything like this. She talked about my father, but she never told me he left something behind." Maybe she thought it would be too painful, Hannah offered gently. Or maybe she didn't know it was there. "Maybe," James murmured. "Thank you. I can't tell you what this means to me. I've spent my whole life wondering what kind of man he was. This gives me something real." Hannah smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I'm glad I could help." They spoke for a while longer, James sharing what little he knew of his father, and Hannah describing the strange way Daisy had led her to the hidden compartment. "Seems like your dog has a good nose for history," he chuckled. "That, or she just knew this needed to be found," Hannah said, glancing down at Daisy, who lay peacefully at her feet. "I think she knew it was important." As the call ended, Hannah sat back, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She reached down and scratched Daisy behind the ears. "Good girl, Daisy," she murmured. "You did something amazing." The golden retriever lifted her head and gave her a gentle lick on the hand before sighing contentedly. Hannah smiled. Sometimes a dog's instincts led to something more than just a hidden treasure. Sometimes they led to a missing piece of someone's heart, finding its way home. Hannah sat on the porch, her fingers wrapped around a warm mug of coffee as she watched Daisy stretch out on the grass, lazily chewing on a toy. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind, and she still hadn't quite processed everything. The discovery in the closet, the connection to James Lawson, and the realization that Daisy had somehow sensed that something needed to be found. It was a lot to take in. But more than anything, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. She had done something that mattered, something that brought closure to someone who had spent a lifetime searching for answers. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her, and she glanced at the screen. A text from James. "Thank you again, Hannah. I still can't believe it. It feels like I've been given a piece of my father I never knew existed." She smiled as she typed a quick reply. "I'm just glad I could help. Your father's words deserved to be read." She set the phone down, exhaling softly. The experience had left her feeling both fulfilled and restless at the same time. She found herself thinking about the past more than ever. How many stories lay hidden in the walls of old houses? How many forgotten voices still lingered, waiting to be heard? Maybe that was why Daisy had been so persistent. Maybe, in her own way, she had sensed that something unfinished needed to be set right. Daisy let out a soft bark, pulling Hannah from her thoughts. The dog's ears perked up, eyes focused intently on something at the edge of the yard. Hannah followed her gaze, expecting to see a squirrel or a passing car, but there was nothing. The street was quiet, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "What is it, girl?" Hannah asked, setting her mug down and standing. Daisy stood as well, tail wagging slightly but her stance alert. Then, without hesitation, she trotted toward the backyard, glancing back as if expecting Hannah to follow. A familiar sensation settled in Hannah's stomach, something between curiosity and unease. She had learned to trust Daisy's instincts. With a deep breath, she stepped off the porch and followed the golden retriever through the grass. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Daisy led her to the far corner of the yard, near the base of the old oak tree. The tree had stood there long before Hannah had moved in, its roots thick and sprawling, breaking through the earth in places. Daisy sniffed along the ground, her movements deliberate, before stopping at a particular spot. She pawed at the dirt, glancing up at Hannah expectantly. Hannah crouched down, brushing her hand over the area. The soil here felt looser, disturbed. "You found something else, didn't you?" she murmured, a chill running down her spine. She ran back to the garage, grabbing the small gardening trowel she kept for her flower beds. When she returned, Daisy was still waiting, her tail wagging slightly, but her eyes locked onto the patch of disturbed earth. Hannah knelt down and began digging, her heart pounding with each scoop of dirt she removed. Minutes passed, the hole deepened, and just as she was about to pause, her trowel scraped against something solid. She stopped, brushing away the loose soil with her fingers until she saw it clearly. A rusted metal box, its surface corroded with age, her breath caught. Another hidden secret. Another piece of a story waiting to be uncovered. Carefully, she lifted the box from the ground and set it beside her. It wasn't large, about the size of a shoebox, and the lid was sealed shut with a small latch. She hesitated for only a moment before pressing against it. The latch resisted at first, then gave way with a quiet snap. The lid creaked as she lifted it. Inside, she found more photographs, wrapped carefully in old fabric, along with a bundle of letters tied together with twine. But there was something else. A small, tarnished medal resting on top of the letters. Hannah lifted the medal, turning it over in her palm. The design was faded, but she recognized it instantly. A purple heart. Her pulse quickened. Whoever had buried this had done so with purpose. This wasn't just another forgotten box. It was something deeply personal, something that had once meant everything to someone. She untied the twine binding the letters together and unfolded the first one. The handwriting neat but aged with time. To whoever finds this, if this box has been uncovered, then I trust that it was meant to be found. I have carried the weight of these memories for too long, and though I have kept them buried, I never truly let them go. These letters are all I have left of a time I can never return to. I hope that whoever holds them now understands their worth. The letter wasn't signed, but as Hannah flipped through the remaining papers, she began to piece things together. The photographs showed a young soldier, the same man from the pictures she had found in the closet. Thomas Lawson. Hannah exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone had buried this box, knowing that it might one day be discovered. And Daisy, somehow, Daisy had led her to it. She glanced at the dog, who sat quietly beside her, watching. "What are you trying to tell me, girl?" Hannah whispered. The golden retriever wagged her tail and nudged Hannah's hand, as if encouraging her to keep going. And Hannah knew she had no choice. She had uncovered part of the story, but there was still more to be found. More to understand. She carefully repacked the box, carrying it back inside. That evening, she spread the contents out on the dining table, poring over every photograph, every letter. The pieces of Thomas Lawson's life were scattered before her, waiting to be understood. As she read, she realized something crucial. The letters weren't just war recollections. They were messages. Some were addressed to Claire, others to James. And one, at the very bottom, was different. The handwriting was shakier and the paper more fragile. It was a letter Thomas had written to himself. "I have done things I cannot forget. I have carried burdens I will never fully understand. But in this, I have found one certainty. I was meant to come home, and I was meant to leave this behind for someone to find. To know I existed. To know that in the end, I tried." Hannah swallowed against the lump in her throat. This was more than just old keepsakes. This was a man trying to leave behind a part of himself. To be remembered. She sat back, running a hand through her hair. There was only one thing left to do. She needed to call James again. Daisy lay beside her, content but watchful, as if she already knew what would happen next. And Hannah, for the first time in weeks, felt certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Hannah hesitated before dialing James's number. She had already spoken to him once, but this was something bigger. This was a deeper, more profound discovery than a few letters hidden away in a closet. This was a message buried beneath the earth, waiting decades for the right moment to be found. She pressed the call button and held her breath. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "Hannah?" "Hi, James. I found something else," she said, her words careful, almost unsure. It's big." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a steady inhale. "What do you mean?" Hannah glanced at Daisy, who lay calmly at her feet, as if knowing she had played her part. "I was in my backyard, and Daisy led me to a spot near the old oak tree. I dug, and I found a box. A metal one, buried deep. It had more photos, more letters, and a medal, a purple heart." James was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "A purple heart? Are you sure?" "Yes, and the letters, they're different from the ones in the closet. These are more personal, more raw. Some addressed to Claire, some to you." She hesitated before adding, and one to himself. The sound of James exhaling was audible. "I need to see them. Can you send me pictures?" "Of course." She stood, already heading toward the table where she had laid everything out. "Give me a few minutes." After ending the call, she carefully arranged the letters and took clear photos, making sure to capture the writing and the details of the medal. Once she had sent them, she sat back and waited. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, her phone vibrated with a response. "James, I'm coming to you. I need to see this in person." Hannah swallowed. She had expected him to be interested, but not to drop everything and come immediately. She typed a quick reply, letting him know she would be home whenever he arrived. Then she looked down at Daisy. "Looks like we've got company coming, girl." Daisy wagged her tail, as if pleased with herself. The next afternoon, James arrived. Hannah hadn't been sure what to expect. His voice over the phone had been steady, but now, as he stepped out of his car, she could see the weight of this moment pressing down on him. He was in his 60s, tall, with silver-streaked hair and sharp blue eyes. He walked with purpose, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his movements. "Hannah," he greeted as she stepped onto the porch. "Come in," she said, motioning him inside. Once in the dining room, James took a long look at the letters and the medal. His hands hovered over the items before finally picking up the Purple Heart. He turned it over, running his thumb across its surface. "This was my father's," he said quietly. "There's no doubt about it. He was awarded one, but we never had it. My mother, she never talked about it. She never said where it went." Hannah watched as he carefully unwrapped one of the letters. His lips pressed into a thin line as he read, his expression unreadable. When he was done, he set it down, rubbing his jaw. "He was trying to leave a record," James murmured. "Even if he never came back, he wanted someone to know." Hannah nodded. "That's what I think too. He must have known he might not return, so he left these behind, hoping someone would find them someday." James sat back, his eyes flicking between the photos and letters. "You know, growing up, I never really knew my father. My mother never remarried, but she never spoke about him much either. I think it hurt too much. When I was little, I'd ask, and she'd just say, 'He was a good man, a brave man.' But that was all." Hannah swallowed. "And now?" He let out a shaky breath. "Now I know more. And that means everything." They spent the next hour reading through the letters, piecing together the fragments of Thomas Lawson's life. His fears, his hopes, his longing for his wife and son. It painted a picture of a man who had gone to war with no guarantees, who had tried to leave something behind that would one day make its way back to the people he loved. Finally, James looked up. "Hannah, I don't know how to thank you. You've given me something I never thought I'd have." "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "It was meant to be found. And Daisy, she made sure it happened." James glanced at the golden retriever, who had been quietly lying by Hannah's side the entire time. "Smart dog," he said, his voice lighter, though his eyes still held deep emotion. Hannah chuckled. "Yeah, she is." James sighed, running a hand over his face. "I want to take these home, if that's all right with you. I want to sit with them, really take my time." "Of course," Hannah said. "They belong to you." As James carefully gathered the letters, the photos, and the medal, Hannah felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a step forward in something bigger than herself. She had helped uncover a story that had waited decades to be told, and she had helped bring a son closer to the father he had never known. James stood, holding the box tightly. "I'll be in touch. There's more I want to know, more I want to understand." Hannah nodded. "I'll be here." As she watched him walk to his car, she felt a shift in the air. Something had changed. Not just for James, but for herself. She had always thought of history as something distant, something bound to books and museums. But now she knew better. History lived in the walls of old houses. It lingered in the ground beneath their feet. And sometimes, with the help of a dog like Daisy, it found its way back to where it was meant to be. Daisy let out a soft huff, curling up at Hannah's feet as if the job was done, at least for now. Hannah smiled, scratching behind her ears. "Good girl, Daisy," she whispered. "Good girl." And in that moment, she knew there was still more to uncover, more stories waiting to be found. And she would be ready when the time came. Hannah sat on her couch later that evening, staring at the empty space on her dining table where the letters and metal had been just hours before. The house felt strangely quiet, as if the weight of history that had filled the air was finally settling. Daisy lay beside her, head resting on Hannah's lap, her warm presence grounding her in the moment. James had taken everything home. That was how it should be. Yet something inside Hannah felt unresolved, like there was still another piece waiting to be discovered. She had learned so much about Thomas Lawson, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Daisy shifted, letting out a content sigh, but then her ears twitched. Hannah glanced down. "What is it, girl?" Daisy's nose twitched, and her head lifted slightly. Then she sat up, ears perked. Hannah followed her gaze toward the hallway leading to the guest bedroom, the same room where this all began. A slow chill crept up Hannah's arms. Was it possible there was still something left to uncover? She hesitated for only a moment before standing. "All right, let's check it out." Daisy trotted ahead, tail wagging with purpose. Hannah grabbed a flashlight just in case, though the house was well lit. The guest room door stood open, the closet door slightly ajar. Hannah swallowed. It was silly to feel nervous. She had already found everything, hadn't she? But as she stepped inside and aimed the flashlight toward the floorboards where she had first discovered the hidden compartment, something caught her eye. A faint shadow along the baseboard, just to the right of the previous opening. It was small, barely noticeable, but now that she was looking for it, it was obvious. Another seam in the wood. Slightly uneven. Daisy whined softly, pawing at the floor just beside it. Hannah's breath hitched. "You found something else, didn't you?" she murmured, crouching down. She ran her fingers along the edge, pressing lightly. At first nothing happened, but then she felt the tiniest give. With growing anticipation, she reached for the flathead screwdriver she had left nearby from before and carefully wedged it into the seam. The board lifted slightly. Hannah's pulse quickened. She pried it up further, revealing a narrow, shallow space beneath the floor. The light from the flashlight reflected off something inside. A small leather pouch, tucked carefully into the hollow. Daisy sat beside her, watching silently as Hannah reached in and pulled it out. The leather was soft with age, the stitching still strong. Hannah's fingers trembled slightly as she loosened the tie and opened it. Inside was a single photograph, folded several times to fit into the pouch. She carefully unfolded it, her breath catching at what she saw. It was Thomas Lawson. Younger than in the other photographs, his uniform crisp and his expression serious. But what struck Hannah most was that he wasn't alone. Beside him stood another man, also in uniform, his arm slung casually around Thomas's shoulder. They looked close. Brothers, maybe? Or just close friends? There was writing on the back, faded but still legible. Thomas and Henry, 1950. Brothers in arms. No matter what happens, I'll keep my promise. Hannah swallowed hard. Henry. She had never come across that name in anything else she had found. Who was he? And what promise had Thomas made? She carefully placed the photograph back into the pouch and sat back on her heels. Daisy nudged her shoulder, as if sensing the questions swirling in her mind. "Looks like we have more digging to do, girl," Hannah whispered. The next morning, Hannah called James. He answered quickly, his voice lighter than the night before. "Hannah," he said, "I was just thinking about calling you." She blinked in surprise. "You were?" "Yeah. I've been going through the letters, and something caught my attention. One of them mentioned a Henry. I was going to ask if you'd come across that name anywhere." Hannah's grip on the phone tightened. "James, I found something else." A pause. "What?" She told him about the hidden pouch, the photograph, the name written on the back. When she finished, James was silent for a long moment. "My mother never mentioned a Henry," he finally said. "And I don't remember any family talking about him either. If he was important to my father, why wouldn't anyone have told me?" "That's what I want to find out," Hannah said. "Maybe there are records, military files, something that can tell us who he was." "Agreed," James said. "I'll start looking on my end. I still have some contacts from my time in service who might be able to pull old records." "And I'll check the historical archives," Hannah added. "I'll let you know what I find." For the next week, Hannah threw herself into research. She scoured online databases, visited the local archives, and even made a trip to the state library. At first, there was nothing. No mention of a Henry Lawson, no connection between Thomas and another soldier by that name. It was as if he had never existed. Then, on the 8th day, she found it. A military roster from 1950. Listed beside Thomas Lawson was another name. Henry Wallace. Hannah's heart pounded. Wallace. Not Lawson. That explained why James had never heard of him. Henry hadn't been a brother by blood. But if they weren't related, why had Thomas called him a brother in the note? She continued digging and found another record. A telegram dated 1951. It was brief, but heartbreaking. To the Wallace family. "We regret to inform you that Henry Wallace has been reported missing in action. Efforts to locate him continue. Sincere condolences. United States Army." Hannah sat back, exhaling sharply. Missing in action. Had Thomas known what happened to Henry? Had that been the promise he mentioned in the photograph? She didn't waste a second. She called James, her hands trembling as she waited for him to answer. When he did, she could hear the anticipation in his voice. "Hannah? Did you find something?" "Yes," she said. "Henry Wallace. He wasn't your father's blood relative, but they served together. And he went missing in action in 1951. James let out a slow breath. "That must be it. That must be why my father hid those things. He made a promise to Henry, but I don't know what it was." "We're going to find out," Hannah said, determination setting in. "I'll keep searching. Maybe Henry's family knows more. Maybe there are letters, records, something." James was silent for a moment. "You know, Hannah, if it weren't for you and Daisy, I don't think I ever would have learned any of this." She smiled, glancing at Daisy, who lay at her feet, ears perked. "I think Daisy's the real detective here." James chuckled. Then tell her to keep up the good work. We still have more to uncover." As the call ended, Hannah looked at the photograph once more. Two young men, standing side by side, bound by loyalty and war. One lost. One carrying a promise that had yet to be fulfilled. She had started this journey by uncovering a mystery in her closet. Now, it was leading her somewhere even deeper. And she wasn't going to stop until she found the truth. Hannah sat at her dining table, staring at the photograph of Thomas and Henry Wallace. The connection between them was undeniable, but so many questions still remained. Why had Thomas buried this photograph? What promise had he made? And why had Henry's story seemingly disappeared from history? Daisy lay beside her chair, her soft breaths rhythmic and steady. Every so often her tail would twitch, as if sensing Hannah's racing thoughts. She reached down, running her fingers over the golden retriever's fur. "What do you think, girl? Where do we go from here?" Daisy lifted her head slightly, nose twitching, before settling back down. Hannah exhaled, picking up her phone. She needed to update James. He had taken his time processing what they had uncovered so far, but she knew he would want to hear about this latest discovery. She dialed his number, listening to the steady ring. It wasn't long before he picked up. "Hannah? Hey, James, I think I found something else." She tapped the photograph lightly against the table, as if the motion would help clarify her thoughts. "Henry Wallace. He wasn't a blood relative, but your father called him a brother. They served together. And I found a telegram from the army. Henry was reported missing in action in 1951. A long pause followed. Then James sighed. "MIA. That explains why my mother never mentioned him. If my father made a promise to Henry, it was probably about making sure he wasn't forgotten." Hannah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I don't think Thomas ever got closure. Maybe that's why he left these pieces behind. Maybe he was hoping someone, eventually, would put it all together." James exhaled heavily. "Do we know if Henry ever had any family? Someone we could reach out to?" "That's my next step," Hannah said. "There has to be something. A relative, a record, anything." "Let me help. I still have a few connections from my time in service. Maybe someone can pull some old military files." Hannah smiled. "That would be great. I'll keep searching on my end." After they hung up, she got to work. Researching Henry Wallace proved difficult at first. There were dozens of records for men with the same name, but none seemed to fit. She scoured obituaries, census records, and military archives. Hours passed, her coffee growing cold beside her. But eventually, something caught her attention, a newspaper article from 1952. The headline read, "Local family still waiting for word on missing soldier." Her heart pounded as she skimmed the article. It described Henry Wallace's service, his deployment to Korea, and his last known location before he was declared missing. But what stood out the most was a mention of his family, his younger sister, Margaret Wallace, who had been just a teenager at the time. Margaret. Hannah jotted the name down. If Margaret had been a teenager in the early 1950s, she would likely be in her 80s now. Was she still alive? If so, did she know what had happened to her brother? And did she know about Thomas? She continued searching, tracking census records and public records databases. After an hour, she found a lead, an address listed under Margaret Wallace's married name, Margaret Callahan. Hannah took a deep breath. It was a long shot, but it was something. She picked up her phone again and dialed James. "Hannah? Did you find something?" Maybe. Henry had a sister, Margaret Wallace. She married and became Margaret Callahan. I think she might still be alive. James was silent for a moment. And you think she knows what happened to Henry? If she doesn't, she might at least have some insight, Hannah said. I want to reach out to her. I know it's been decades, but if she's still here, I think she deserves to know what we found. James let out a slow breath. I agree. Do you want me to come with you? Hannah smiled. I'd like that. 2 days later, Hannah and James stood outside a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house had a well-kept garden, and wind chimes tinkled softly from the porch. Hannah's nerves buzzed as she knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door opened, revealing an elderly woman with sharp blue eyes and neatly curled gray hair. She eyed them cautiously. Yes? Can I help you? Hannah exchanged a glance with James before speaking. Mrs. Callahan, my name is Hannah Reynolds. This is James Lawson. We've been researching your brother, Henry Wallace. The woman's expression shifted. Surprise. Wariness. And then something softer. Nostalgia, perhaps. Henry? Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Yes, Hannah said. We think we found something he left behind. Or rather, something Thomas Lawson left behind for him. Margaret inhaled sharply at the name. Thomas? Oh my, I haven't heard that name in years. You'd better come inside. They followed her into a cozy living room filled with framed photographs, bookshelves, and the scent of fresh tea. Margaret gestured for them to sit before lowering herself into a chair. Tell me everything, she said. Please. Hannah and James took turns explaining what they had found. The hidden letters, the buried photograph, the military records indicating Henry had gone missing. Margaret listened intently, her hands folded in her lap. When they finished, she wiped at her eyes. Henry and Thomas were inseparable, she murmured. Henry used to write to me about him all the time. He said they looked out for each other over there. And then, one day, the letters stopped. We never knew what really happened. We waited for word, but all we got was that telegram. My mother never gave up hope. But my father, he knew. James leaned forward. Did Henry ever talk about any kind of promise between them? Something Thomas might have sworn to do? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. Henry told me once that if anything happened to him, Thomas had promised to make sure his family knew the truth, to find a way to tell us what really happened. Hannah swallowed. I think he tried, Mrs. Callahan. I think he did everything he could. But something stopped him from ever finishing. Maybe he never got the answers he wanted either. Margaret reached out, squeezing Hannah's hand. You've given me something I never thought I'd have. Even after all these years, knowing Henry had someone like Thomas watching over him means everything. Thank you. James exhaled, his voice thick with emotion. I think my father would have wanted you to have these. He handed Margaret the photograph of Henry and Thomas, along with a copy of the letters. Margaret held them like something precious, her fingers tracing the faded edges. I'll cherish this, she whispered. I'll share it with my grandchildren. Let them know about the uncle they never met. Hannah sat back, feeling something shift inside her. There was still more to uncover, more stories waiting to be told. But for now, this moment, felt right. Daisy had led her to something bigger than she had ever imagined. And she had a feeling there was still more ahead. Hannah sat in her car outside Margaret Callahan's house, the conversation replaying in her mind. Margaret's eyes had been full of both sadness and gratitude. A woman who had spent her life wondering what had happened to her brother. Now, at least, she had something tangible. Pieces of Henry's past that had been buried in time. But there was still a missing piece, something Hannah and James both knew needed to be found. Daisy let out a soft sigh from the passenger seat, her golden fur reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Hannah reached over, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You've led us this far, girl," she murmured. "I think we've got more work to do." James had been quiet on the drive back, staring out the window, lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "I keep thinking about my father. He carried this with him all his life. If he made a promise to Henry, I don't think he ever stopped trying to keep it." Hannah nodded. "But something stopped him. He never told your mother, never told you. He hid the letters, the medal, the photograph. And now we know he buried that promise, literally, in my backyard. Why? What was he trying to protect?" James exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "I think the answer is in Korea. We know Henry went missing in action. But what if my father knew more? What if he saw what happened but never had a way to tell anyone?" Hannah considered that. The records they had found only said Henry was missing, but they had no personal accounts, no first-hand information. If Thomas had been there when Henry disappeared, it would explain why he had kept those letters for so long. Maybe guilt, maybe loyalty, maybe both. "We need military records," she said. "Beyond the ones we've already found. We need first-hand reports from the men who were there. If any of them are still alive, they might know something." James pulled out his phone. "I can reach out to a few people who still have access to old records, and I'll check veteran organizations. Someone might remember." Hannah nodded. "I'll start looking into archives, see if I can track down any other reports about that mission. If Henry was declared missing, there had to be a last known location, a last person who saw him." Daisy, as if sensing the renewed determination, perked up and wagged her tail. Hannah smiled. "And of course, we have our secret weapon." James chuckled. "Yeah, the best detective we could ask for." Over the next few days, Hannah and James dove deep into research. Hannah contacted historical societies, military record offices, and even old newspaper archives. James reached out to veterans organizations, hoping someone, somewhere, had a connection to the unit Henry and Thomas had served in. 3 days later, James called her with a lead. "Hannah, I found someone." She sat up straighter, gripping the phone. "Who?" "His name is Walter Briggs. He served in the same unit as my father and Henry. He was there when Henry went missing. And he's still alive." Hannah's heart pounded. "Where is he?" "South Carolina. He's in his 80s now, but he agreed to talk to us. Said he remembers the day Henry disappeared." Hannah was already reaching for her keys. "We have to go." A day later, they arrived at Walter Briggs's small home, a cozy place surrounded by towering oak trees. A nurse helped him to a chair on the porch, and as soon as they introduced themselves, his faded blue eyes sharpened. "You're Thomas's boy," he said, looking James over. "I'd recognize that face anywhere." James swallowed. "Yes, sir, I am. And this is Hannah. We've been piecing together what happened to my father and Henry Wallace." Walter's gaze turned solemn. "Henry Wallace. Good man. Never should have gone the way he did." Hannah's breath caught. "You were there? When he went missing?" Walter nodded. "We were stationed on the Eastern Front, close to enemy lines. The night Henry disappeared, it wasn't an accident." James stiffened. "What do you mean?" Walter sighed, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "We were ambushed. Some of our men were taken, captured. Most were never heard from again. Henry was one of them. Your father, Thomas, fought like hell to stop it, but we were outnumbered, and afterward we had orders to move forward, no way to go back. No way to search for the men we lost. Hannah's stomach twisted. So Henry wasn't just missing. He was taken. Walter nodded grimly. Your father never forgave himself. He tried to go back for Henry, but command wouldn't allow it. Said it was too risky. He spent years trying to find out what happened to his friend. He wrote letters, spoke to officials, but there were no answers. Just silence. And I think that broke him. James clenched his jaw. He must have buried those letters and the medal because he never got closure. He was still holding on. Walter studied them both before speaking again. I think your father knew that if someone ever found those letters, they'd keep looking. And now, here you are. Hannah felt a wave of emotion rise within her. We need to know what happened to Henry. If he was captured, did he ever make it out? Was he a prisoner of war? Did anyone ever find a record of him? Walter sighed. That's the question your father never got answered. But maybe now you will. James nodded, his expression set with determination. Then we keep going. We find out what happened. Walter reached out, gripping James's hand with surprising strength. Your father would be proud of you, son. He never stopped searching. And neither should you. As they left Walter's house, Hannah glanced at James. We're not done yet. If Henry was captured, there have to be records. Somewhere. We just have to find them. James nodded. And we will. Daisy, sitting in the back seat, let out a small huff, as if to remind them that she was ready too. Hannah smiled. They had started with a hidden closet and an old letter. Now they were following a trail that stretched across history, and they weren't stopping until they found the truth. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming against her knee as James drove in silence. The road stretched ahead of them, the late afternoon sun casting golden light through the trees. Daisy, ever vigilant, sat in the back seat, her head resting against the window, ears flicking at every passing sound. The weight of their last conversation with Walter Briggs sat heavy between them. Henry hadn't simply vanished. He had been captured. I keep thinking about what Walter said, James muttered, breaking the silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. My father must have spent his whole life trying to find out what happened to Henry. And now here we are, still chasing that answer. Hannah nodded, staring at the road. We need to find out if Henry was ever reported in a POW camp. There have to be records, even if they're classified or buried somewhere. If your father never found anything, it could mean the records weren't released during his time. But now, maybe... James glanced at her before focusing back on the road. Maybe we can find something he couldn't. They drove for another hour before stopping at a small roadside diner. The place was quiet, save for a few truckers and an elderly couple sipping coffee by the window. They slid into a booth, and Hannah pulled out her laptop, while James ordered coffee for both of them. Military archives, government reports, declassified documents, she murmured, clicking through her searches. There has to be something. James sighed, rubbing his face. I reached out to a friend who used to work in records retrieval for the Department of Defense. He said he'd look into old reports, but even if we find a mention of Henry, tracking him from there is another challenge. Hannah bit her lip. If Henry was officially recorded as missing in action and later captured, then there should be prisoner logs from the Korean War. Some of those camps were later liberated, some prisoners released, but others never made it home. James tensed. If Henry died in captivity, my father never knew. He spent his whole life wondering. Hannah squeezed his hand gently. We're not going to stop until we know. A few minutes later, her search led her to a database of war prisoners. It was an older site, its interface clunky, But as she input Henry Wallace's name, her heart started pounding. A list of names loaded onto the screen. There, she breathed. Henry Wallace, captured in 1951, held in a POW camp. James leaned in, eyes scanning the details. He was officially recorded as a prisoner, but there's no date of death, no release date either. He just disappears. Hannah frowned, scrolling through the records. That doesn't make sense. Prisoners were either liberated, exchanged, or listed as deceased, but he's just unaccounted for after a certain point. James clenched his jaw. What happened to him? Hannah's mind raced. There's only one way to know. We need to track down someone who was there. Someone who might remember him. James exhaled slowly. That's not going to be easy. Most surviving POWs are in their 90s now, if they're even still alive. Then we find their families, Hannah said firmly. Anyone who might have heard stories, anyone who might still have letters or records passed down. We're not hitting a dead end. Not now. James nodded. I'll start making calls. They spent the next several hours reaching out to historical organizations, veteran groups, and military researchers. Most calls led to dead ends, but finally, one of James's contacts gave them a name. Richard Mendez, a retired historian who specialized in Korean War POW cases. He's been collecting testimonies for years, James explained as he dialed the number. If anyone knows something, it's him. The phone rang twice before an elderly voice answered. This is Richard. Mr. Mendez, James said. My name is James Lawson. I was told you might be able to help me with a case involving a missing Korean War POW. There was a pause. I get a lot of those requests, son. You'll have to be more specific. James inhaled deeply. Henry Wallace, captured in 1951, held in a POW camp, but his records disappear after that. My father served with him. We need to know what happened. Silence stretched over the line before Richard finally spoke. Henry Wallace. I know that name. Give me a day. I'll see what I can dig up. James thanked him, and they ended the call. Hannah leaned back in the booth, letting out a slow breath. That's something. It's more than we had this morning. James nodded, but his eyes remained troubled. But what if what we find isn't what we want to hear? Hannah met his gaze. Then at least we'll know, and your father's promise will finally be fulfilled. James swallowed hard and nodded. We'll wait for Richard's call. But in the meantime, we keep searching. They drove back to their motel that night, Daisy curling up at the foot of Hannah's bed. James paced near the window, his mind clearly racing. Hannah sat up, watching him. You should try to get some rest. James shook his head. I can't stop thinking about it. My father must have carried this weight for decades, and now it's on us. Hannah stood and placed a hand on his shoulder. Then let's carry it together. James sighed and finally sat on the edge of the bed. Thank you, Hannah, for all of this. She smiled softly. We're in this together. Daisy let out a sleepy sigh, and Hannah finally lay back down. Tomorrow, there would be more calls, more records to dig through. But for now, they had taken another step forward, and they wouldn't stop until they reached the truth. The next morning, Hannah woke to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She blinked blearily at the screen. An unknown number. Her heart jumped as she sat up, immediately answering. Hello? Is this Hannah Reynolds? A deep voice asked. Yes, this is she. This is Richard Mendez. I found something. Hannah swung her legs over the side of the bed, instantly awake. Across the room, James sat up too, rubbing his face as he tried to shake off sleep. Daisy perked her head up from where she lay at the foot of the bed, ears twitching. "What did you find?" Hannah asked, gripping the phone. There was a pause before Richard spoke again. "I went through my notes, some old military testimonies from former POWs. I found a name. Wallace. Henry Wallace. There's something you need to know." Hannah exchanged a glance with James, who was already swinging his feet to the floor. "Go on." "Henry Wallace was one of the men taken during a prisoner march in early 1951, Richard said. "He was held in a camp near the Yalu River. From the testimonies I've collected over the years, he was known among the prisoners for keeping morale up, for helping others hold on even when conditions were at their worst. But here's where things get complicated." James leaned in, listening intently. Hannah put the phone on speaker so he could hear. "There's no official record of his death," Richard continued, "but there were reports from men who made it home. Wallace was seen alive in the camp. Then one day he was taken away. The men assumed he was being transferred, but he was never seen again." A chill ran down Hannah's spine. "So he didn't just die in captivity? He was taken?" "That's what it looks like," Richard said grimly. "And there's more. A few soldiers who were repatriated years later claimed that some prisoners were moved deeper into North Korea. Some even rumored to have been sent to China or the Soviet Union. It's possible Henry Wallace was one of them." James sat completely still. "Are you saying he might have survived? That he could have been alive long after the war ended?" "It's possible," Richard admitted. "But if he was sent elsewhere, there may be no records. He might have lived his life in captivity without anyone back home ever knowing." The room fell silent. Hannah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Henry had been missing for decades. Could he have survived? Lost to history, unable to return home? James exhaled slowly. "My father must have suspected something like this. He kept looking because he couldn't accept that Henry had just vanished." "Exactly," Richard said. "And now you have more than your father ever did. If you want to keep going, I can try to connect you with a researcher who specializes in cases like this." Hannah met James's gaze. He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said firmly. "We need to know what happened." "Understood," Richard said. "I'll send you the details. In the meantime, you should check any records related to Soviet archives. If Henry was transferred, there might be something there." "Thank you," Hannah said, her voice tight with emotion. "We'll follow up." After they hung up, James ran a hand through his hair. "If Henry was moved, if he never made it back, we'll find out," Hannah assured him, "one way or another." For the rest of the day, they scoured available records, searching for anything that might indicate where Henry had gone. They cross-referenced old war reports, declassified intelligence files, and even memoirs of former POWs. The pieces were scattered, but a picture was starting to form. One that suggested Henry Wallace's story didn't end in 1951. That evening, James received a call from Richard again. "I have someone you need to talk to," Richard said. "A man named Arthur Miles. He's an independent researcher who's spent years looking into American POWs possibly sent to Soviet labor camps. If Henry was transferred, he might know where to look." James didn't hesitate. "Give me his number." An hour later, they were on another call. Arthur's voice was calm but methodical, the voice of someone who had spent years buried in historical records. "I've seen cases like this before," Arthur said, after they explained what they'd found. There were men who were never officially declared dead, but their records simply stopped. Some were taken to China for interrogation, others sent further into the Soviet Union. If Henry Wallace was one of them, he might have been used for intelligence purposes. James frowned. Used? Interrogated, possibly even forced into labor. The Soviets didn't always return prisoners, especially if they thought they were valuable. Some men were kept for years. Hannah swallowed hard. And if he survived? Arthur hesitated. Then he would have had to find a way to live. Some former American prisoners in the Soviet Union eventually integrated into society there. Some never tried to come home because they thought they wouldn't be believed. James was silent for a long moment. So you're saying Henry could have lived out his life somewhere in Russia? And no one ever knew? It's a possibility, Arthur said. If you're serious about this, I can help you file inquiries with archives in Russia. It's difficult, but not impossible. James took a deep breath. We're serious. Hannah nodded. We have to do this. Arthur agreed to help them navigate the complex process of requesting international records. It would take time, but they were closer than ever to understanding what had happened to Henry Wallace. As they ended the call, James leaned back against the chair, his expression unreadable. He might have lived, he murmured. All this time, he might have been out there. Hannah reached for his hand. Then we'll find out. Whatever it takes. Daisy stirred at their feet, as if sensing the shift in energy. She stretched, then settled back down, her presence comforting as ever. James exhaled a, "We keep going." Hannah squeezed his hand. "We keep going." Hannah sat at the small desk in their motel room, her laptop open, the dim glow of the screen illuminating her face. James was on the other side of the room, pacing near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. Daisy lay curled up at the foot of the bed, her tail twitching as she dozed. It had been hours since their last call with Arthur Miles, and now they were in the thick of researching Henry Wallace's potential fate. Hannah had spent most of the night combing through declassified military documents, but most of the files were incomplete or redacted, leaving her with more questions than answers. James let out a sigh as he ended his call and turned to face her. That was Arthur again. He's reaching out to a contact in Moscow who might have access to old Soviet prisoner logs. If Henry was sent there, it's possible his name is buried in some classified archive. Hannah nodded, her eyes scanning the screen. I keep finding mentions of American POWs taken to Siberian labor camps, but nothing definitive. Some of these records talk about men forced to work in mines, factories, and even military installations. If Henry was one of them, he might have been kept alive for years. James ran a hand through his hair. And if he survived? What then? What if he made a life there? What if he never tried to come home? Hannah exhaled slowly. We have to consider every possibility. Maybe he was never given a chance to leave. Maybe he was told he was forgotten, that no one was looking for him. Or maybe he believed it. James's jaw tightened. My father never stopped looking. Henry had to know that. Hannah hesitated. But if he had no way of knowing, if he was told it was hopeless, if he was convinced he'd never see home again? James sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face. Then we find out the truth. We owe it to him. Hannah turned back to her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She typed in a query, searching through Cold War intelligence reports. The results were scattered, but then she saw something that made her pulse quicken. James, she said, eyes locked on the screen. Look at this. He stood and moved beside her, peering over her shoulder. The document was an old intelligence report from the 1960s, detailing suspected American prisoners held in Soviet labor camps. Among the listed names was an entry marked H. Wallace, status unknown. James let out a breath. That has to be him. Hannah nodded. It means someone, at some point, suspected he was there. If his name made it onto a list like this, it's likely that the US government knew more than they ever let on. James clenched his fists. So my father spent his life searching, and they might have had this information all along? Hannah placed a hand on his arm. We don't know for sure, but this is something. It's more than we had before. James nodded, his expression hardening with determination. Then we follow it. We keep digging. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly. Arthur managed to connect them with his contact in Moscow, an independent researcher who had access to Soviet-era archives. The process was slow, but piece by piece, they began to put together a timeline. Henry Wallace had been captured in 1951. He had been held in a North Korean POW camp before being transferred, possibly to China, possibly to the Soviet Union. The records became murky after that, but there were whispers of American prisoners being transported to remote labor facilities, far from any chance of rescue. One evening, just as Hannah was about to close her laptop for the night, an email notification popped up. She clicked on it, her breath catching as she read the message. "James," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "You need to see this." He rushed over, scanning the screen. The email was from their contact in Moscow. Attached was a scanned document, an old faded file stamped with Soviet markings. Hannah opened the attachment, her heart pounding. The document was in Russian, but a rough translation was included. It detailed the interrogation of an American prisoner in 1952. The name listed was Henry Wallace. James's breath hitched. He was there. He was alive. Hannah read further. The document described Henry as defiant but cooperative. He had refused to provide military intelligence, but had apparently adapted to life in captivity. The last known mention of him was in 1954, when he was transferred to an unknown location. "Unknown location," James repeated. "That could mean anywhere." Hannah leaned back in her chair. "But this proves he lived longer than anyone thought. He wasn't just missing in action. He was taken." James swallowed hard. "My father never knew. He never got the confirmation he needed." Hannah reached for his hand. "But we have it now, and we're not done yet." They continued their search, now focusing on Soviet records from the mid-1950s. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Henry Wallace had become part of a much larger, much darker story, one that had been buried for decades. And they weren't stopping until they found out everything. Hannah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Henry's name on that old Soviet document, the words "transferred to an unknown location," circling in her mind. It was a phrase that could mean anything. It could mean he had been moved to another camp, sent further into the Soviet Union, or worse, lost in a system that had no intention of ever letting him go. James was equally restless. He sat in the motel chair by the window, staring out into the night, his fingers occasionally tapping against his knee. Daisy lay at his feet, sensing his unease, occasionally shifting but never moving far from him. "We need more," James finally muttered, breaking the heavy silence. "We need to know where he went." Hannah nodded, her fingers poised over the keyboard of her laptop. "Arthur's contact in Moscow sent us this document, but there have to be others. If Henry was transferred, there would have been some kind of paper trail. We just have to find it." James ran a hand down his face, exhaling. "I keep thinking about my dad. All these years he never gave up. He buried those letters because he knew there was more to the story. And now, we're finally seeing it." Hannah turned back to her screen, clicking through files, trying different searches, using every variation of Henry Wallace's name she could think of. She had spent so much time combing through archives that the interface of these military databases had become second nature. Still, every dead end felt like a setback. Then, just past 2 a.m, something new appeared. "James," she whispered, her pulse kicking up. "Come look at this." He was by her side in an instant, his eyes scanning the screen. It was another Soviet document, declassified within the last decade. It referenced a group of American POWs who had been moved from Korea to Soviet territory in the mid-1950s. "Look at this name," Hannah said, pointing to a line in the translated document. "It's not Henry Wallace, but it's close. H. Walensky." James frowned. "That's not him." "Maybe not," Hannah agreed. "But what if it is? The Soviets were notorious for changing names, altering records. Walensky could have been a misinterpretation, or even an intentional alteration to hide his identity." James leaned closer, his breath shallow. "Where was this Walensky taken?" Hannah scrolled down. "It says he was transferred to a labor facility east of the Ural Mountains, a camp used primarily for foreign prisoners. But after 1956, nothing. No further records." James rubbed his jaw. "That lines up with the last reference we found. He was in a camp in 1954, then moved. If Henry became Walensky on paper, that might explain why the trail went cold." Hannah's mind raced. "If we can confirm that H. Walensky was Henry, we might be able to find out what happened to him after 1956. Maybe he was moved again, or maybe—" She didn't finish the thought. The possibilities were endless, but the reality was clear. Henry Wallace had not simply vanished. He had been taken, hidden, and possibly forced to live under an assumed identity for the rest of his life. James stood, pacing again. "We need to go deeper, contact Arthur's researcher again. See if there are any personal testimonies from that camp. If there were other prisoners, someone might have known him." Hannah nodded. "I'll email him now. And we should check Red Cross records. If any Western agencies ever tried to account for prisoners in that region, they might have notes we haven't seen." James pulled out his phone and started dialing. "I'll reach out to a few people, see if we can get more eyes on this." The next several days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and hours spent buried in records. Every piece of information felt like a step forward, but there was still so much missing. The connection between Henry Wallace and H. Walensky was tenuous, a possibility rather than a certainty. Then, one afternoon, Hannah received a response from the Moscow contact. "Hannah!" she called out, barely able to contain her excitement as she waved James over. "He found something." James hurried to her side, reading over her shoulder as she opened the attached file. It was another Soviet record, this one from 1957. The name on the document was H. Walensky. The file noted that he had been transferred again, this time to a smaller labor camp deep in Siberia. And there was one more crucial detail: an interview with a fellow prisoner from the camp. "Here," Hannah pointed at the translation. "This prisoner said Walensky spoke fluent English, had an American accent, and often talked about home. When asked where home was, he only ever said one thing: Missouri." James's breath caught. Henry was from Missouri. Hannah nodded. "It has to be him." James sat down heavily, rubbing his face. "So he was still alive in 1957. That's years after he was taken. He survived." Hannah scrolled further. "The document ends there. No further records of him after that point." James let out a slow breath. "Then we have to find out what happened next. If he lived through 1957, he could have lived longer. Maybe he was eventually released. Maybe he..." He stopped, not wanting to say the alternative. Hannah reached for his hand. We keep going. We're closer than ever. We know more than your father ever got to know, and we won't stop now. James squeezed her hand in return, nodding. We won't stop. Daisy let out a small huff, stretching out her legs as if she too was preparing for the road ahead. Hannah smiled down at her. I think Daisy agrees. James chuckled, some of the tension easing from his face. Then let's keep moving. We have a name, a location, and a timeline. We're going to find out what happened to Henry Wallace. And with that, they dove back into the search, more determined than ever. The next morning, Hannah woke with a renewed sense of determination. She and James had come further than anyone else in uncovering Henry Wallace's fate, and now they were closer than ever to the truth. She glanced over at James, who was already awake, staring at his phone, scrolling through old military records and notes from their last few conversations with Arthur's contacts. Daisy stretched lazily on the floor, yawning before padding over to rest her head on James's knee. We're going to find him, Hannah said quietly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. James exhaled, setting his phone down. Yeah, we are. And if he's gone, we're going to make sure the world remembers him. Their next step took them deeper into the archives. Arthur's Moscow contact had sent over additional Soviet-era records, and one document stood out, a record from 1963. It referenced a man fitting Henry's description, listed as an American detainee in a remote Siberian settlement. The document noted he had been in the camp since 1957 and had lived among other former prisoners, working as a laborer. Hannah's breath caught as she read aloud. He was there. That's 6 years after the last known record of him. James nodded slowly, taking in the weight of the discovery. If he was still alive in 1963, there's a chance he made it even longer. But why was he never found? Why didn't he try to get home? Hannah scrolled further. There's something else here. The report says some of these detainees were given Soviet identities. They were absorbed into local villages. If Henry became one of them, he might have stopped trying to get back because he thought no one was looking. James swallowed hard. My dad was looking. His whole life, he was looking. Silence stretched between them. It wasn't just about Henry anymore. It was about Thomas Lawson's lifelong mission, the search that had defined him. And now, his son was standing in his place, picking up the pieces he never could. Daisy let out a soft huff, nudging James's hand with her nose. He stroked her head absent-mindedly. What now? He asked. We go to Moscow, Hannah said simply. If Henry became one of those men who disappeared into the Siberian settlements, the only way to confirm it is to go there. We need to find out if there are descendants, records, anything that proves he was there. James let out a slow breath and nodded. Then we go. A week later, they arrived in Moscow. Arthur had arranged for them to meet a researcher familiar with post-war Soviet detainees. His name was Mikhail Ivanov, and he had spent decades uncovering stories of prisoners lost to the Siberian labor camps. Mikhail greeted them in a quiet cafe, his expression one of curiosity. You have done impressive work, he said in careful English. Many people have tried to find what happened to the men who disappeared, but few have come this far. James slid the copies of the records across the table. We need to know if Henry Wallace was one of them. If he lived, if he had a life here. Mikhail studied the documents, nodding slowly. I know these villages. Some of these settlements still exist today. There are elders who remember the Americans who lived among them. Perhaps one of them knew your Henry. Hope flickered in Hannah's chest. Then we go there. Over the next several days, they traveled east, following old roads to remote villages. They spoke to people who had lived through those years, some who still recalled the foreign men who had arrived as prisoners but stayed as neighbors. Finally, in a small town nestled near the Siberian taiga, they met an elderly woman who changed everything. She sat by her window, wrapped in a thick shawl, her hands weathered by time. When Mikhail asked about American prisoners, her eyes clouded with memory. And then she spoke a name. Walensky. James's breath caught. H. Walensky. That was the name in the records. The woman nodded. He was kind. He spoke of a place called Missouri. He said he had a family, but the war took it away. Hannah gripped James's hand tightly. What happened to him? The woman sighed. He lived here many years. He had a quiet life. He worked. He helped others. But he always looked west, as if waiting for something that never came. James's throat tightened. When did he pass? She frowned, thinking. It has been more than 20 years now. Hannah and James sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Henry had lived. He had made it through captivity, through decades in a foreign land. But he had never made it home. James wiped his face, his voice raw. He wasn't forgotten. Hannah nodded. And now, neither is his story. They stood at the edge of the village, staring out at the vast, endless land. They had found him. Henry Wallace's story, hidden for decades, was now uncovered. Thomas Lawson had searched until the end of his days, and now his son had brought that search to its conclusion. James placed a small stone at the village's memorial, whispering a quiet goodbye. You were never alone, Henry. We found you. Daisy sat beside him, silent and steady, as if she too understood the weight of the moment. And with that, Hannah and James turned back toward the road, ready to carry the truth home.